If you remember in our first story today, how Joseph was down in the pit. His brothers had thrown him down into that pit, and they were going to leave him there to die. Do you think Joseph thought that God had a plan for him at that point? I think he did. I think he was trusting in his God all through this time. Even when he was in the pit, he was trusting in God. But he's not the only one that was hated. When we come to the New Testament, we find out that Jesus was hated. And we're going to find out a little bit about that today. But before we get there, we want to go back to where Jesus first began his ministry, when he was about 30 years old. When Jesus was about 30 years old, he went to John the Baptist. And he asked John the Baptist to baptize him. And after John baptized him, the heavens opened, and the Spirit of God flew like a dove down and landed on Jesus. And then the Father from heaven spoke and said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased." Does that remind you a little bit of Joseph? Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, his loved son. And Jesus was God's loved son. Well, after that, he went into the wilderness, and he was tempted by the devil for 40 days. And during that time, he didn't have anything to eat. But after that time passed, he had still never sinned. He never sinned. And he started traveling around and preaching in different synagogues. And then we come to Luke chapter 4, verse 16, and it says here, "And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up." This is where he grew up. "And as was his custom, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and he stood up to read. And the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where he wanted to read, which was Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. And what did that look like? Well, it looked kind of like this. This is Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. Can you read it? I can't read it either. Because it's in Hebrew. And in Hebrew, you read from right to left. From right to left. Instead of, in English, we read from left to right. But in Hebrew, they read it what we would think is backwards. And I don't even see the letters of our alphabet up there. Their letters are completely different. But I happen to know what it says. So here's what it says in Isaiah 61, verses 1 and 2. "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So what is that talking about? Well, you see, in the Old Testament, God had promised that he was going to send someone they called a Messiah, who would take care of our sin problem. And this scripture is about the coming of the Messiah to proclaim good news to the poor. Is that what Jesus was doing? Yes, it was. To proclaim liberty to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind. Jesus did those miracles, didn't he? To set at liberty those who were oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Now we know that Jesus is the promised one. he is the Messiah. But the people in his village there in Nazareth didn't know that. So as soon as he finished reading the scroll, he gave the scroll to somebody to put it away, and he sat down and he said, "Today, this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Today, this scripture is fulfilled. And they were thinking, what's he talking about? Who's he talking about? This is about the Messiah. Is he saying that he's the Messiah? Couldn't be. We all know him. He grew up here. He's the son of the carpenter. He's the carpenter himself. He couldn't be. And Jesus knew what they were thinking. And so he said to them, he told them what they were thinking. And that made them angry. And so they got so angry that they jumped up and they started yelling. And they started shoving Jesus out of the synagogue. And they started shoving him away from the synagogue. And they took him out to a hill where there was a steep cliff. And it says that they intended to throw Jesus off of the cliff. But Jesus knew it wasn't the right time for him to die. He did come to die, but he knew this wasn't the right time for him to die yet. And so it says that Jesus passed through the midst of them, and they didn't even realize he was leaving. I think they all thought, don't you have a hold of him? Who's got a hold of him? Where is he? And he just kept walking on and on and on until he walked right away from them. And he was gone because he knew it was not the right time. But you see how the people of his village hated him? But they weren't the only ones who hated him. And tomorrow we're going to find out some other people that hated Jesus too. Why did they hate him? Because he was a light. He was a light showing them where their sin was. They liked darkness. They wanted to hide behind their sin in the darkness. But he was a light, and he showed them where their sin was. That's why they hated him.